genealogist of Greek, Sephardic, and Eastern Jewry. He's the editor on a monthly academic publication, a journal called Sfarad VeHamizrach. And he's the founder of the Foundation for Jewish Diversity in Los Angeles and the Beit LaMoreshet Kehilot Sfarad VeHamizrach in Jerusalem. He teaches, and he has numerous academic affiliations, including the Hebrew University, the Aristotelian University in Thessalonica, the University of Denver, the American Jewish University of Los Angeles, and the Sephardic Education Center of Jerusalem. So without further ado.
All right, so this is mostly a lecture. There's no podium in the new revitalized library, but so I have 21, 22 slides, but mostly I'll read to you like the history of Sephardic and Eastern Jewish migration at the time of World War I. In World War I, there were distinct migratory trends of Sephardim and Jews originating from Arab lands, from the Mediterranean to the Americas. Most of the migration consisted of Sephardic and Eastern Jews, but also Ashkenazi Jews from Adam and Eretz Israel, who were exiled and migrated to the Americas and even Australia. These Jewish migrants set up their own synagogues and communities in the Americas and laid down traditions for the next generations, including naming patterns from the community and lands of origins, mixed with name changes in the new country. Some examples of the naming process amongst these various groups will be discussed in the presentation. When Monastir was bombarded continuously in 1916, 1917, and under siege, much of the community migrated to Temuco, Chile, Rochester, New York City, Los Angeles, and Indianapolis in the United States, and also to Florina and Salonika in Greece. Other Jews from Monastir began to emigrate to the Americas in the first decade of the 20th century, settling primarily in New York City, Rochester, Cincinnati, and Indianapolis in the United States, and in Temuco, Chile. Sephardic Jews started migrating from Monastir, now called Bitola, at the beginning of the 20th century, during the final decline of Ottoman rule in the region of Macedonia, and for precarious reasons settled specifically only in Chile in all of Latin America, but found commercial niches in the periphery of Chile in faraway locations like Valparaiso, La Serena, Coimbo, Arica, Concepcion, Coronel, and Tragun, but mainly in Temuco. So if you know Israeli backpackers, I'm sure maybe they got to some of these places. Individuals from Monastir settled in all of these places between 1906 and 1907. Marguerite Bejarano traced the initial migratory impetus as follows. A typical story is that of Alberto Levi of Monastir, Macedonia, who left his hometown in 1900 and after wandering in different countries arrived in Santiago, Chile, where he was offered a job as a tailor in the frontier town of Temuco. His letters home attracted other Jews and eventually led to the establishment of the first Sephardic community in Chile. Usually the Jews first, if they went to South America, first they went to Argentina, and they dispersed to other places like Chile or Paraguay. In the capital of Chile, in Santiago, Alex Arditi was the first to establish a commercial house in the country during this period. And in 1910, Zacharias Yani maintained a prayer group at his home at Marine 80 in the capital. But despite the dozens of Monastir Jews in Temuco, which is also, it's about 500 kilometers north of Santiago, a synagogue called Centro Macedonia was only established in 1916. In 1917-1919, they laid the foundations for a self-help communal organization called La Sociedad Israelita de Socorros Mutuos. In Valparaiso, the Sephardim were amongst the founders of the Zionist organization Sociedad Max Nordau, formed sometime shortly after the 1917 Balfour Declaration. In 1918, In 19, another Sephardic philanthropic organization was founded in Temuco entitled La Sociedad Chesed Ve'emet. Interrupting. So today we have the files of this Sephardic community of Temuco in the central Zionist, in the central archives for the history of the Jewish people. So they were donated about 3-4 years ago. No one's really researched there, but it's a large collection of dozens of files. So if you're from a Jerusalem Sephardic family, there's a good chance that somebody from your family is a monastir family. In 1918, many Sephardic men from Temuco temporarily returned to Monastir to find brides to take back to Temuco, Chile. The Sephardim of Temuco were very Zionist, together with the local Ashkenazim, participated in the first Zionist convention of Jews from the provinces of Chile in 1918, and participated in the first Jewish Congress in Chile in 1919. Together with the Ashkenazim of Temuco, they also formed the Centro Sionista, and also the Organización Universal Sionista in 1919. Sephardic family names in Temuco included Ergas, Albala, Levi, Levi de Mayo, Paradis, Asael, Kamchi, Nachmias, Navon, Hasson, Russo Arwesti, Aruti Ergas, Ergas Ventura, Israel, Sarfatis Pesach, and where you have the hyphen, that's relevant because these families go by two names. Essentially, one of those family names was the name of a woman in the family. So in other words, they're not simply Ergas, they always identify specifically as Ergas and whatever the additional name. That's very common amongst many Sephardim. Other names, Cohen Ventura, Cohen Shavite, Albala, Casorla, Chame, Kamchi, Kesta, Negrin, Aruti, Calderon Baruch, Ergas Meshulam, Moznaim, Russo, Mois, Asael, De Mayo, Benkis, Toledano, Elias, and Saban, Toledano, and Arwesti. After the large 1917 fire in Salonika, where the British troops did not intervene to extinguish the flames, since they thought that the city would be overrun by the Entente, Jews from Salonika migrated to London and New York. These are typical pictures from Salonika, a postcard. Ottoman Jewish Salonican female dress. While I continue talking, you can read what I wrote here. As the Ottoman Turks were losing the war to England in Eretz Israel in World War I, in 1917 there was mass famine which prompted many deaths and migration. Noticeable in World War I from Eretz Israel were migrations of Yemenite Jews to New York, as well as the expulsion of the non-Ottoman subjects, many being Ashkenazi Jews from Safed, Jaffa, and Jerusalem who migrated to nearby Egypt or as far away as Perth, Australia, or Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, Brazil, and established their own synagogue, which existed until today. Ottoman Sephardic Jews had been patriotic subjects in Eretz Israel, but in World War I, Russia, as well as England and France of the Triple Entente, was the enemy of the Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire together with Germany and Austria. Many of the Ashkenazi Jews who had migrated to Eretz Israel after 1870 were under Russian consular protection, and in World War I, they were expelled as enemies to the Ottomans as they were losing their grip on Eretz Israel. In 1917, the Jews of Jaffa were expelled to the Galilee and abroad. During World War I, the Jewish population declined because of the war, famine, disease, and expulsion. In 1915, approximately 83,000 Jews lived in Palestine amongst 590,000 Muslim and Christian Arabs. Only 56,000 Jews remained when British General Allenby entered Jerusalem on 11 December 1917. Anita Shapiro described the conditions in which tens of thousands of Russian Jews had to leave or adopt Ottoman citizenship, she wrote. When the war broke out, the Ottomans seized the opportunity to rescind the system of capitulations. Overnight, the country's foreign subjects found themselves at the mercy of the Ottoman bureaucracy's arbitrariness. People lost faith in Turkish currency, which led to the hoarding of food and staples and a run on the banks. The authorities declared a moratorium on withdrawal of money. The situation deteriorated further in October 1914 when Turkey entered the war on Germany's side. Tens of thousands of Russian Jews living in Palestine became enemy subjects and were required either to leave the country or assume Ottoman citizenship, which mandated conscription into the army or payment of a high indemnity. Many opted to leave. The first deportation of foreign subjects was on 17 January 1914, was very brutal in nature. In April 1917, foreign subjects were deported from Tel Aviv and Jaffa. The deportation was conducted as follows. The deportation of foreign subjects from Palestine was executed without prior warning. A sudden announcement informed all foreign subjects that they must immediately board an Italian ship anchored in Jaffa port that was about to sail to Alexandria. Pandemonium ensued. The police treated the deportees savagely, families were separated from their children, and cargo and baggage were loaded without their owners. Some dreadful scenes led the German consul to lodge a bitter complaint with his counterpart in Istanbul. Jamal Pasha was reprimanded, while the officer in charge of the deportation was transferred from his post. Mass deportations were stopped, but replaced by selective ones. With the clear intention of driving out every last vestige of the Yishuv leadership, the Turks ordered party leaders, heads of the local committees, teachers, public intellectuals, and all the leaders of Zionist institutions to leave. I have another quote here. The expulsion of the Jews from Jaffa was depicted as such. After Allenby's failed attempt to take Gaza in March 1917, the inhabitants of the southern part of the country were ordered by the Turkish authorities to leave their homes and go into exile. The residents of Gaza were forced to move northward under harsh conditions with no aid from the authorities. On Passover Eve, fueled by the Turks' fears of Allenby advancing northward, the residents of Jaffa were also ordered to leave. At the time, some 10,000 Jews lived in the city, including approximately 2,000 residents of the handsome new neighborhood to the north, Tel Aviv. Carts from the Moshavot and the Galilee were the only means of transport available to the exiles, and they rolled out of Tel Aviv loaded with bedclothes and kitchen utensils, atop which sat the families that had managed to organize themselves before leaving. They were the minority. Most left on foot. Tel Aviv became a ghost town, with only a few young people allowed to remain and guard the houses against looters. The exiles first came to Petach Tikva, then dispersed to all the Moshavot in Samaria and the Galilee. In the meantime, a typhus epidemic spread throughout the Turkish forces, then infected the civil population. The exiles, who often had to find shelter in shacks or woods adjoining the Moshavot, were particularly susceptible to disease, and lacking sanitary conditions or medicines, they were decimated by the epidemic. That's the end of the quote. You have Sephardic families in Jerusalem, for example, because of the epidemics and because of the famine, lost even most of their families. I once interviewed a Sephardic guy, families were originally Turkish. They were here in World War I. Of 18 siblings, only 3 survived. When the Jews of Jaffa were expelled on 28 March 1917, it was forbidden them to settle in Jerusalem or Haifa. The poor were to be placed between Damascus and Aleppo and given housing and food. The order of expulsion was for Ottoman and neutral subjects and those of the allies of Turkey, who were Germany, Bulgaria, and Austria. They were to be cared by the governments. Eventually, the Yafo exiles settled in Petach Tikva and In Gani. As the Turks were losing and the populations had to be evacuated to prevent mass killings, the Jews of Petach Tikva and In Gani were expelled, while some 500 amassed in Kfar Saba, where in total there were 1,500 exiles. In February 1918, with hunger, overcrowding, and disease in Kfar Saba, the refugees were moved at the initiative of the Jewish medical officials and the Vada Hagirah, the migration committee, to Samaria in the Galilee. You understand, I tried to map all this out to explain it because it's very complicated. So if you had relatives there and you want to track them, they kept on being expelled. So they were probably in a few places and only for a very short time.
But my mother said that they weren't expelled, they were supposed to be expelled from Petach Tikva, and that the Turkish army needed the oxen for something else, and so they ended up staying in Petach Tikva.
Okay. The Jews of foreign and enemy nationalities, mainly Russian nationality, were exiled from Jaffa to Egypt when they refused to become Ottoman subjects. In mid-December 1914, 698 Jewish exiles arrived in Alexandria. By the end of 1915, their numbers in Egypt reached 12,277. From mid-December 1914 to the end of January 1915, American battleships brought 7,475 refugees to Egypt. At the end of 1915, there were 4,400 exiles, of which 1,200 were supported by the American Jewish Support Committee in Alexandria. On the 15th of September 1916, the American Joint Distribution Committee decided to terminate funding the exiles, but after the protests, supports were renewed. Their archives on this are very scant for this period. It's also the beginning of the organization. The first exiles and detainees reached Damascus in October 1917. They were treated better than the first points in their detention in Tiberias, Nazareth, and Judea, Samaria, where they were tortured. A transport of hundreds from Jerusalem, Jaffa, and the southern Moshavot arrived in mid-December 1917. Amongst them were dozens of Jerusalem notables who were exiled by Jamal Pasha in the last days of Ottoman rule, who were accused of support for Zionism. Also, the Turks included hundreds of draft dodgers located in the Moshavot of Yehuda, Rishon LeZion, Rehovot, Petah Tikva, and Kfar Saba. This group of 126 Jews was called the Jerusalem prisoners. In total, there were some 2,000 Jewish Eretz Israel exiles in Damascus. During World War I, Sephardim and Kurdish Jews came from Eretz Israel to Panama and settled in the cities of David and Cologne. After World War I, Sephardim from the Balkans, Syria, and Morocco migrated to Panama City. Eventually, the Eretz Israel Jews also moved to the capital, Panama City, where they were affiliated with the Shevet Achim congregation, which is predominantly Aleppoan in number, and prayer minhag is staunchly Orthodox. So, there was a family called Mizrahi. Originally, they're Kurdish. They came here starting in the 1880s. They also settled in Jericho. They also opened the Kolnoa Eden, which today is Mea Sharim, all that. And they developed the type of banana already in Jericho, but their banana became Chiquita banana, which if you live in the Western Hemisphere of America, you know all about.
Just been sold.
Like Monsanto, probably.
Yeah.
They're putting poison in the banana. Okay, during World War, when Ottoman Janina became Greek in 1912, many Romanio Judeo-Greek-speaking Jews migrated to New York and established synagogues where they resided on the Lower East Side, Harlem, and Bensonhurst. The Romaniot, whose Jewish culture was Greek, since Byzantine Jews from Yanina, Greece, initially were devoted Ottoman subjects. They spoke Greek and were not Sephardic, but resented Greek rule beginning in 1912 and had already began migrating to the United States in the first decade of the 20th century with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. After resented Greek rule was established in 1912, Yanniot Jews migrated to New York in larger numbers. Perhaps as many as 4,000 of the 7,000 Jews in Yanina migrated to New York in the 1900s and 1910s. They established 4 synagogues in New York by the early 20th century. Their migration to the United States continued until general migration restrictions were placed in the United States in 1924. The Jews from Castoria, a town initially in the Ottoman Empire and then annexed to Greece in 1912, began to emigrate to New York in the early 1900s. A small group also settled in Rio de Janeiro. In New York, the Castoriales eventually established synagogues in New Lots, Brooklyn, and Cedarhurst, Long Island. Initially, the children of this community were sent to an afternoon Sephardi Talmud Torah in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, and later to similar classes on Sunday in their suburban conservative synagogue in Cedarhurst, Long Island, which still exists today. New York City had numerous Sephardic Landsmannschaften organizations: Chesed Ve'emet de Castoriales, the Brotherhood of Adrianople, the Brotherhood League of Rhodes, the Salonican Sephardic Brotherhood, and more. Although these societies provided assistance to the new immigrants through loans, contracts, and fraternity, and by helping them with the American acculturation process, they also furthered Sephardic fragmentation, prevented unity, and hindered the formation of unified synagogues, schools, burial societies, a professional Sephardi Judeo-Spanish theater, and a long-lasting Judeo-Spanish press. In short, because you had all these different groups that had different melodies from the community of origin, they didn't want to be with the others. So they had their own synagogue, their own Talmud Torah, and eventually they were too small to maintain all these things, and financially it didn't work. So eventually they remained they kept the synagogues, but that was about all. The Salonican Sephardic Brotherhood was the biggest of 3,000 members. It started as a burial society, but the problem was the Salonicans, they wanted to unite all the Sephardim, but they wanted to be in charge. So they didn't give any chance to anyone else, so of course all the others split off. But they're still a burial society today. And they established a settlement in New Jersey, and they left Harlem and New York City, and they went to Raritan, New Jersey, where they worked in the Michelin tire factory, and then they moved to New Brunswick, and now they have a synagogue today for the last, let's say, 70, 80 years in Highland Park, New Jersey. Joseph Papo presented some details of Sephardic migratory patterns to the United States. All in all, some 3,413 Sephardi immigrants from both the European and Asian parts of the Ottoman Empire arrived in the United States between 1899 and 1908. It was ironically the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, abolishing the separatist status of all religious and national groups, which provided an additional impetus for many young Sephardi men to emigrate. This enlightened legislation, bestowing the dignity of Turkish citizenship on all the inhabitants of the land, also imposed the duty of military service hitherto reserved for Muslims on all its subjects. So the Jews were forced to go to the army or evade, and when you went to the army, you usually never came back. You were neglected, and that's the story we know from Palestine, but it was a much bigger phenomenon. Also, I think those figures we saw earlier in the last lecture were a little low for the Ottoman Empire. This enlightened legislation, bestowing the dignity of, or rather, it imposed this duty on all of its subjects who were unable to pay a $200 replacement tax, a tax which had to be paid during each of all too frequent mobilizations occurring during these turbulent years. For an observant Jew, induction into a Muslim army was tantamount to having to forsake his religion and being forced to break a number of commandments. Thus, if he was of limited means, he was left no choice but to emigrate. The Jerusalemites who couldn't afford it, they ended up serving, and many of them were in Damascus. Further waves of emigration were engendered by the 1911 Turco-Italian War, the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913, the outbreak of World War I, and by a series of natural disasters such as fires, earthquakes, and epidemics, which were plaguing the crumbling Ottoman Empire. Papo added that the flow of Sephardic immigration slackened, followed the entry of the United States into World War I, but increased after the termination of the hostilities with the immigration of some 10,000 Sephardi into the United States between 1920 and 1923. The nationalities quota law of 1923 closed the door to immigration, and the Sephardi began migrating to Cuba and South America in the hope that they would eventually be admitted into the United States. But of course, most of them didn't succeed, and that's why they stayed there. In most cases, no such opportunity opened for these Sephardim, and they made their permanent homes in those Latin American countries. Turkish Jews from large cities like Izmir or Istanbul, or smaller towns like Marmara, Rodosto, and Çanakkale, parallel to those from Salonika and Greece, migrated to the Americas at the beginning of the 20th century. Some emigrated after the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, the Balkan Wars, 1912-1913, and World War I. Many Izmir Jews left their hometowns because of harsh, violent, and restrictive temporary Greek rule when they attacked Asia Minor in the years 1918 to 1922, and migrated to the Americas after World War I, or during the first half of the 1920s. Jews from Izmir and Istanbul were the founders and the main congregant base of the Kahalim, you know what that is, Beit El in Rio de Janeiro, and the Camargo Synagogue in Buenos Aires, founded in 1918 and 1919 respectively. Turkish Jews are the overwhelming majority of the Judeo-Spanish-speaking Sephardic community of Buenos Aires, which in 1919 evolved into the Asociación Comunidad Israelita Sefardita de Buenos Aires. The initials are ACIS. Jews from Rhodes began to immigrate to Buenos Aires during the first decade of the 20th century, and by 1929 they founded the Kal Shalom Synagogue. Several Rhodian Jews, including the Rhodian Sephardic leader Moses Chami, were also amongst the founders of the Sephardic B'nai Tzion Zionist Organization in 1914. Sephardic synagogues of Jews from Istanbul and Izmir, Turkey, were also established in other Argentinian cities, including La Plata, Rosario, La Plata, and Tucumán. Fearing future political instability and in search of better economic opportunity, Turkish Jews began to emigrate to Cuba in the early 1900s, during the last years of Ottoman rule. At the time of the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913 and World War I, some Turkish Jews left out of fear of military conscription. In 1914 in Havana, they established the Uniona Ebrea Shevet Achim Synagogue, an independent Sephardic Jewish community, separate from the Ashkenazi community. Margalit Bejarano explained the second phase of the migration of Turkish Jews to Cuba and Argentina. Immigrants from Izmir to Argentina and from the European Turkey to Cuba illustrate the second migratory flow that followed World War I. Many of them were victims of massacre and plunder from the Greek occupation of Thrace, Macedonia, and Anatolia from 1919 to 1922. Fleeing from their hometowns, they traced the paths of relatives and neighbors who had emigrated before the war. The communal organizations that were founded by the early immigrants in Buenos Aires and Havana became responsible for the newcomer. Immigration increased in 1924 when Turkish Jews again feared military conscription, this time during the establishment of the modern Turkish Republic. Turkish Shevet Achim Synagogue in Havana had a social welfare department and assisted the Turkish Jews who arrived after World War I. The Turkish Jews, especially the groups who arrived after World War I and the above Turkish military conscription in 1924, also lived in the coastal towns of the far eastern part of the island where they were peddlers and merchants who served the rural agricultural population. Jews from Silivri near Istanbul tended to settle in Kamorge, and those from Kirkisli near Edirne migrated to Oriente. Sephardic religious and communal organizations, mostly of Turkish Jews, settled in Manzanillo, Ciego de Avila, Camajuani in the Santa Clara province, Colón, Camagüey, Guantanamo, Artemisa, Matanzas, and Santiago de Cuba in Oriente province, the most eastern point of the island. So Ruth Bahar, her family came from a community way out there, like 700 kilometers east of Havana. And in all these places, the Jews had general stores, they were merchants, peddlers, sold fabrics, etc. Jews from Salonika and elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire, namely from Turkey, settled in Mexico City at the beginning of the 20th century as the Ottoman Empire was breaking up. Economic decline setting in, and political instability was a regional problem. These groups increased their numbers after the 1908 Young Turk Revolution. These Judeo-Spanish-speaking Balkan Jews, together with others who migrated from Bulgaria, founded their own synagogue, independent Sephardic community, Union Sephardita in 1923, which exists today and is one of 4 separate communities in Mexico City. Syrian Jewry, like many Ottoman Jews in the Balkans, began migrating to the Americas out of fear of military conscription after the 1908 Young Turk Revolution. Syrian Jews from Aleppo and Damascus, in separate communities and with separate traditions and communal identities, established themselves in Buenos Aires, Mexico City, and New York. In 1912, the Damascus Jews in Mexico City founded the Alianza de Monte Sinai congregation, but the Aleppoan Sociedad Beneficencia de la Esencia Israelita Sedekah y Marpeh was only established in 1928. That's a long one. Syrian Jewish migration to the Americas halted in World War I, and families were separate during the duration of the war. The initial French Mandate authorities blocked their options to migrate, but by the early 1920s, conditions prevailed, enabling the above migratory chains to continue. The Judeo-Spanish Hakatria dialect-speaking Jews from Spanish Morocco, mainly from Tangier and Tetuan, but also from other communities like Melilla, migrated to Caracas, Venezuela before World War I, but only formed the synagogue Sociedad Israelita de Venezuela in 1919. Most of its Balkan Sephardic migration to France is after World War I, in the 20s and mainly in the 30s, but the poor neighborhood in Paris, where Turkish Jews live, is called Rue de la Roquette. Most of the middle class, whether it was Salonican or Turkish, lived near the Opera in the 9th arrondissement, in the 9th district, and there you still have some synagogues which remain. In the poor neighborhood in the 11th, by a metro stop, Republique, there's the Abravanel synagogue, which we saw the riots this past summer there. And that initially was a Salonican synagogue, not a Turkish synagogue then. And then just on the same subject, so the elites and the wealthy lived in the 16th arrondissement, but they didn't have synagogues there. So here I sum it up, so you can see where in the Balkans and around the Mediterranean everyone migrated.
Thank you.
אתה יכול לפתוח פשוט מישהו אחר את הדלת.
It's not locked.
Thank you. Now, do we have any questions?
כן, אני לא בטוחה שהבנתי האם הקהילות שתיארת, במיוחד במדינות האלה, הם התחילו להיבנות מההגירה הזו, או שהם היו גם קודם?
בעיקר היו קודם. זאת אומרת,
לא, התכוונתי...
לפני מלחמת העולם הראשונה, על פי רוב בתחילת מאה ה-20, נשמע התפרקות של האימפריה העות'מאנית. מכל מיני קהילות, פחדו מהניוון הכלכלי, מהאי-ודאות הפוליטית, מהפחד והחשש של גיוס חובה. וזהו, אז בודדים, בדרך כלל נערים היו מהגרים. איכשהו בדרך לא דרך, תראה, אני לא סיפרתי על דברים אחרים, כי זה רק מלחמת העולם הראשונה, אבל נגיד, אז 5 בחורים, בני 15-16, הם היו מתחילים לסחור משום דבר, ואז הם הביאו אחרים, או אחרים שמעו עליהם. ואז באו, ואחר כך הביאו את הנשים, אז זאת אומרת, המוקד פה זה רק מלחמת העולם הראשונה, יש עוד הרבה הגירות והגירות קודם ואחרי זה, ואני סיפרתי אבל קהילות שהושבעו על ידי מלחמת העולם הראשונה והתחזקו כתוצאה מהמלחמה ובעיקר התווספו אחרי המלחמה. זאת אומרת, בזמן המלחמה לא הייתה הרבה אפשרות להגר, אז באו אחר כך. עיירה או עיר כמו מונסטיר היה במעצור איזה 1.5 שנה של הפגזות, ואז נגיד שהיו מפגיזים, אז בלוני גז ומפעלי גז היו מתפוצצים, זה היה איום ונורא. קהילה כזאת הם התחילו לעלות ארצה, נגיד בשנות ה-80 של המאה ה-19, אבל התמקדתי על מלחמת העולם הראשונה. אז הם, בזמן המלחמה, הם לא יכולים לברוח, אני לא רציתי לסבך את כל העניין, כי בבלקן כל חצי שנה, כל שנה, המשטר השתנה, אוקיי? אז קשה לתאר לכם בכל קהילה ובכל אזור תחת איזה משטרים. אבל רק יש מגמה אחת, נגיד, יוון ניסתה לכבוש את טורקיה, לקבל בחזרה את הגבולות של האימפריה הביזנטית. אז בעיקר הם כבשו את אדירנה ואסיה הקטנה. וכתוצאה מכך הרבה יהודים טורקים הגרו לא לארץ, או לצרפת או לארצות הברית, או לדרום אמריקה. אבל רוב ההגירה היא כתוצאה, נגיד, מהמלחמה, מהרעב בארץ ישראל, מהשינוי בבלקן בעיקר, מהשלטון העות'מאני שיהודים העריכו, נגיד 450 שנה, והם במיוחד לא רצו להיות תחת שלטון יווני, ואפילו שלטון בולגרי במקרים מסוימים. אז הם התחילו להגיע.
תודה.
תודה. Now, before we wind this little session up, and before I invite Rose Feldman